we've had sexual tension with forms of governance in all of these questions. So let's embrace it full on. So this thought experiment is inspired by Winston Churchill's quote, where he said that democracy is the worst form of government,
Mm.
except for all other forms of government.
Mhm.
Frankly, I don't know if that Winston Churchill actually said that,
Okay,
but
we'll quote him for
yeah,
now.
we'll roll with that, and then we can correct that later. So what I want to do is I want to now pick your brains on, and I know you're a good person to do this because you've obviously studied these examples and many others, and you have dabbled in international relations and politics. This has been your passion for a long time. So let's start with what is an ideal form of governance. In fact, let me just take one step back. Do we need a government? And I'll just to give you some context for that. Lately, I've been listening to become Michael Malice, who promotes the idea of anarchy. And what he says is largely what you've said so far, that governments are just a control state that mainly looks to maintain its status quo and power, and they don't really address any issues. In fact, if you look at India, look at US, the problems that they've had with poverty, illiteracy, race, still there. In fact, the only progress has been made has been in spite of the government, not because of them. Can you actually name any leaders who made a difference? It was just the people who actually came forward and fought for their rights. And the government does not really address any of those issues. And every year they just give you candidates that are not viable options at all. And it just feels like there's a small group of people that don't really care about other ones, and but they are always the ones in power, and they don't really end up making any difference. And what he argues with anarchy is that if there was no government at all, and interestingly, I had a conversation with this recorded an episode where we spoke about Burning Man, which is basically celebrating anarchy, and there's no government, there's no structure as such. And what they find is that people end up forming their own groups, and they're all helping each other out. The good points are enhanced, and the ones that don't follow certain protocols or don't follow what's ethical and moral are just weeded out naturally. What do you think of this? Do you think we need a government?
I think at various stages of my life, I've flip flopped between being a realist and an idealist. And the realist in me rejects the concept of anarchism because what it doesn't prepare you for is in a world in which anarchy is the norm, where anything goes, anything works. How do you account for the current how do you account for the current differences in social class, in economic class, and all these different social and economic stratifications? With Burning Man, the problem with that example is that you have a bunch of people who are wealthy in the real world play anarchy for a few days, which has a lot of benefits for sure. It allows you to see governance and ideas of kinship and dissonance in very very specific ways. But what it also gives you is the cushion that, let's say all else fails here, that let's say I'm outcast in this society, I can go back to the comfort of my Silicon Valley room where I pay thousands of dollars a month to live in or whatever, right? I'm being very stereotypical here with the typical Burning Man person that goes in, and I know it's not just those kind of people. Um, but in a world in which anarchy is the norm, I don't know how those societal differences get accounted for. And the problem is that, yes, we can talk about anarchy as this ideal concept, just as we can talk about communism and socialism and all of these. And I love those concepts because ideally it accounts for an more equal society than it is. But the problem is we are transitioning from a society which is deeply unequal. And the realist side of me cannot differentiate between, oh, in an ideal world where everything is anarchy, where this, I still think about how do you transition into anarchist kind of governance or an anarchy from where we are today. And that unfortunately gives me no clarity on whether or not these social or economic stratifications will continue to exist. And if they do continue to exist, what's preventing the already wealthy or rich from, controlling the mechanism of delivery of, basic needs to everybody? And that's my issue with and thinking about ideal systems.
Can I just stop you there
Yeah,
for a
yeah,
moment? I don't
absolutely.
want to interrupt you, but I
No,
just want to explore this for a moment. Do you think these social certifications are necessary? And this is something that George Carlin referenced when he said that The rich are just there to collect all the money, pay none of the taxes. The middle class are always there to do all of the work and pay most of the taxes. And the poor are just there to scare the shit out of the middle class so that they keep showing up to work.
Right.
So, do you feel that this is all part of, there's the best way to put it is a facade, if that's the right word for it, to make you feel that this has to exist for an ordered society when actually there are other ways to do it?
Absolutely. I think society does not have to have definitions for people in many ways, right? And again, that's the ideal society that doesn't have it. But in a world in which these definitions already exist, these stratifications, these demarcations exist, we have to build a governance system that can uplift those that are unfortunately that have been pushed to the bottom of society by others that once utilize their powers to do it. And don't come at me with the but I'm not responsible for the things that my ancestors did. You're not responsible for it, but you're benefiting from that system. And unless you recognize that privilege, unless you recognize the years of kind of light and massive and sometimes even sometimes even smaller progressions that your generations have experienced to be in those places that you are, you're not really kind of accounting for the efforts or like the oppression that your ancestors have done that you're sitting on. And so, sure, right? Like I can go on length about how caste should not exist, how economic stratifications are horrible, whatnot, etc., etc. But what I want to discuss is like how do you fix all these? And I think that's the conversation that we need to move into instead of like discussing theory that really doesn't that really is not going to amount to anything. It's good to exercise your mind to think about what an anarchist society might look like, what a communist society might look like, what a socialist society might look like. But all this, unfortunately, takes away from our reality. How do we transition into any of these things? Right? Like currently, there are systems in place. Unfortunately, there are systems in place that only work a certain way. How do we dismantle those systems? Let's talk about that. Let's not talk about 3 steps from now, which is a great theoretical exercise. Again, I'll say that you and I can have an evening of just sitting and talking about ideal systems in the world, but I think it's more useful to talk about how such transitions can happen and how we can harness the voice of the people, the demands of the people, to kind of build a more equal society in which these kind of stratifications don't exist or is reduced to as much of a possibility as it is.
So, you're leaning more towards having a government, but do you recommend having a national form of government, or do you see an idea where there's a global government that works? Just to give you some context again, so there is India, which exists as a country, which you all know Harari largely says is an imagined reality. The borders are really just all imaginary. In fact, there's a lot that's common between all our neighboring countries, and then there's US as well has imaginary borders, and we have our own imaginary, let's say, rules that we follow, and they can all break apart immediately tomorrow if you want. I mean, tomorrow you can just acquire annex a new land, and then that's part of the USA. It all changes. It's all very fickle, and these demarcations of countries creates a lot of conflict. Then you start fighting for land, for prosper, for wealth, for oil, or just power over other countries. Which, if you look back and take a larger view, world view, what it ends up doing is science and technology takes a backseat. Climate change takes a backseat because every country wants to do what's good for it, but not for what's good for the planet. If it ends up taking a hit, because let's say tomorrow India says that yeah, we want to do something good for the climate, and we will sacrifice this much of our budget, but there's another country out there which will not do it, and then India will say that why should we do it if the other's not doing it? So these borders that we have created around us are holding us back in a way as well. So, are you in favor then of having national governments, or is there an idea where there's a global governance system that might work?
Ooh, now we're stepping up. I think the ladders when it comes to having the kind of intense discussions that like I guess is going to be useful for the world. So The problem is with the kind of like global liberal world order kind of narrative is that it again takes away from the years of oppression that a lot of these other countries are sitting on, right? You have this global order. It's very easy for the US, it's very easy for the UK, it's very easy for Europe, and maybe now even China to say that, oh, let's all be part of this global system and make rules that are beneficial for the entire world. Great. And I'm going to say something really controversial now. When you're sitting on years of benefit to you, be it through whatever system it is, and I'll give you a couple examples, it's easy for you to, impress upon the world what needs to be done based on what's good for you at the moment. What I mean by that, this is the US and the UK were historically some of the most protectionist, empires and countries in the world. And here you are maybe 100 years later talking about a global world order in which we have open markets and open borders, and you make grains and we make computers and you make this and we make the fancy stuff. The reason that the US and the UK and all these other countries are able to make these high end sellable products is only because that they were protectionist for all their growth, and now they're telling little countries that are building industries in their backyards, don't make these industries because you're good at grains and whatnot. No, it doesn't work that way. I think it's impossible to make an argument for a global system of uniform laws and uniform rules and uniform articulations unless the world is treated in an equal like starting point. And unfortunately, that's not going to be the case because it's going to be the powers that be that set the rules because it's beneficial to them and they have the power to do it. We are seeing that in the UN with the veto power. Like, I can't believe it still exists to this day that there are 5 countries that say that we get a chance to decide what's good for the world. Hell no. Who are they to say that? And who are they to say that India shouldn't industrialize or that Tanzania shouldn't industrialize? So it's a deeply unequal system that we're starting with. And that's my problem. It's while it sounds ideal to my I think US educated senses that says, hey, it's great, let's not be protectionist and let's build a world in which there's open borders and open visas and this, it's still going to be deeply unequal because it's the people in power that have had that, jump start for the countries in power, sorry, that have had the jump start for decades and centuries that are going to lead the way. Um, Look at China. The reason that China is able to compete with the world right now is because they were protectionists for the longest time. They built their industries and they didn't give a damn about what the world said at that point. I think that's why we're lagging behind in many parts of the world. And that as long as the global world order is set by the countries that are in power, we'll never go to a situation in which is beneficial to all.
Can we explore that for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very interesting point what you just raised. But the argument against it would be that one, if we are truly to progress into a next tier of our civilization, if we are to start talking about colonizing other planets, the solar system, that's the next step, that's the next frontier for us, then fighting like apes and killing each other just for land or just for money seems like a very primitive mindset. That would be one. And the second argument against it would be that the world itself is now heading down a more globalized and connected, integrated path. What's happening now is that in the US, let's say, most of the software is being created by Indians, and most of the clothes are coming from Bangladesh. So now that the whole talk about AI taking over the jobs has come through, and they're talking about universal basic income, the argument is that you might put a universal basic income in the US, but most of your products are coming from the subcontinent, and those are the guys that will get affected. So tomorrow, if you have, for example, not happening anytime soon, but a robot, a 3D printer controlled by AI that starts making clothes for you, it's not jobs in the US that'll get affected, it'll get jobs in Bangladesh. But the US is not making laws for Bangladesh. That's only possible if you have a global entity that's looking after the needs for all of them.
I actually disagree. I don't think there needs to be a global entity that has to say what's right and wrong for the world to operate in, right? Again, what we're going to do is we're going to stand by the values that the US sets because the US is going to say we need cotton workers in Bangladesh to produce this for us, and this is all we can afford. So the universal basic income at the floor should be XYZ. I'm saying no because if Bangladesh develops its factories to a certain level that they are operating in a capacity in which they can create the final products that can rival what's created in the US, right? In terms of, like, let's say a global brand emerges from Bangladesh that's able to compete with a Nike and whatnot. And that can only happen once you've, industrialized to a certain point where you're not just exporting the raw material to these countries to just snap their marketing and brand on. I'm saying every country needs to have an opportunity to stand on their own 2 feet first, because until then you're going to be slave to the global market space, which has been deeply unequal for the longest of times. So I'm not saying that it's not right to have a global basic income that applies to all. I'm just saying that as long as we are operating from a position in which US has had a head start for like a century and Bangladesh is starting over here, I'm just saying that at this point, if you try to build a global order, a global system, I'm just saying the US is going to set a floor that's comfortable for them. I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that Bangladesh is not going to be at that point in which it's comfortable for them. And not just that, let's say you set the floor over here, Bangladesh is going to have textile workers, US is going to have software engineers. And so even if you set the floor, you're not setting it for yourself, you're setting it for other countries. And so what's US got to lose to say that, okay, let the minimum wage be 10, whereas it's all its citizens are earning $25 an hour. That's my issue with this whole situation.
Point taken. Okay, so you are leaning more towards having governments and national governments. So let's go back to the first principle thinking. The first question that we had is, what do you think should be the ideal form of government now? Do you think we've cracked it, or there is a way to go?
I don't think we've cracked it. I think every situation demands its own sort of, I guess, answer. And a system that works in X place need not work in Y place, and I'm completely okay with that. I'm not saying that we need to move into autocracy. I'm just saying that sometimes a stronger government can undo the oppression of certain privileged classes. But at the same time, you need to have a system in place in which the voice of the people is ultimately the strongest voice that can ever be undertaken in whatever jurisdiction it is, right? What I mean by that is also that it should not be in a situation in which, just because we say the voice of the people, I don't mean that, okay, if 90% of the people say I want a Hindu rashtra in India, by default of 90% of people being Hindu and asking for it, that there are no protections in place for its minorities or its poor people. I'm saying, when we say protection for all, it really means protection, support, and a just society for all. And the voice of the majority should be as important as the voice of the minority, and systems should have a mechanism in which it can all be balanced out. And that's how you respect your citizenry, that's how you respect your own people, and that's how you build a more equal society. So sometimes that might take the shape of more freedom, like don't mess with what we have going on. Sometimes it might take the form of more governance. Sometimes it might take the form of overthrow to for it to happen, a little bit of anarchy. But it never will and never should take the form of a foreign power jumping into its own conclusions based on its own society to say that this is what should work for you, and that should never happen. And for people who feel like the US is the harbinger of democracy in the world, go read a history book. The US is one of the most destructive powers in the world, and it has continues to continue to be that in the world. I say, let own countries and its own people figure out what is needed for them. We don't need anybody to set the stage for other countries based on what you think is right or wrong. Your own people don't think what's right and wrong. So how are you saying what's right and wrong for the rest of the world?
Do you say the American dream is non-existent?
I think the American dream is a reality for a lot of people who wish to pursue the American dream. But I feel like there should be an Indian dream and a UAE dream and a Chinese dream, and everybody's dreams are important.
So George Carlin once again said that they call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it.
Man, if only he were alive to
was-
share a few more of these,
Would have
pearls
been
of
really,
wisdom.
really interesting to see what you have said.